So, negating a tautology. What happens when you negate a tautology? What does it make? A contradiction. What happens when you negate a contradiction? You make a tautology. Yeah. And vice versa. So, negating a tautology makes a contradiction. Negating a contradiction makes a tautology. And, right, and on and on and on and on and on. And deductive logic is full of stuff like that. Right. Over on this side, what happens if you negate a true? Is a true synthetic proposition a tautology? No. Is a false synthetic proposition a contradiction? No. Right. You get a completely different kind of logic over here. There's no tautologies, no contradictions, negating a, well, what does it mean to say something is a true synthetic proposition? If we're going to be exactly, precisely right about what we say about the proposition, if we're going to say something about a synthetic proposition, and if colloquially we say it's true or false. Claims about the world, I'll say some claims are true, some are false, right? It's true there are no cubical planets. It's false that there are no extrasolar planets. But what am I really saying if I'm going to be really precise? Well, what I'm really saying is very, 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 very unlikely to have a cubical planet. It contradicts the laws of physics, and the laws of physics are very likely to be true. We have lots and lots and lots and lots of evidence for the existence of extrasolar planets, so it's very unlikely to be false. So this is very unlikely to be true. If we negate it, right, what happens if we negate it? If we negate there are no extrasolar planets. But it's not true that there are no extrasolar planets, or just there are extrasolar planets. Well, that's something very likely to be true because of what we know, the observations and so on. So negating negating synthetics or negating synthetic propositions doesn't make tautologies or contradictions. So negating synthetic propositions doesn't make tautologies or contradictions. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. Now I'm gonna put in the kicker and the thing that makes this a sort of philosophical doctrine rather than simply a couple of categories. Because Hume did not think that this was the whole story. Hume added something to this distinction, which is a claim about logic itself, or is a claim about all the propositions you have or could ever have in the universe, especially all the true propositions you could ever have in the universe. Put it in red because it's scary. Hume said, and I agree with him, that every proposition is, I'm going to try and write very precisely here. Is exactly one of these. Every proposition is exactly one of these. So, okay, I'm gonna erase this, and I'm hoping you guys, everybody's got this in their notes, because we'll probably have to look at it again as we go. But so I'm going to call this, instead of just the analytic-synthetic distinction, I'm going to call this a doctrine. I'm going to call this Hume's analytic-synthetic doctrine. So Hume took this distinction and he said something about it which goes beyond just stating the distinction. Every meaningful proposition, meaningful might be redundant. If your idea of what a proposition is a unit of meaning, then all propositions are meaningful, and if it's not meaningful, it's not a proposition. But I'm throwing in meaningful here to emphasize that this has to do with meaningfulness. Every meaningful proposition is exactly one of these categories. Or I should say is in. There we go. Right. So what does this mean exactly? Exactly one. If a proposition is meaningful, that is, if it's not sort of a incoherent noise, that it means something. If a proposition is meaningful, it is either analytic or synthetic, but neither nor both. So every proposition is one or the other. Every proposition is either analytic or synthetic. No proposition is any other kind. If you can imagine other kinds of proposition, they don't exist, according to this doctrine. If you say, well, there could be analytic or synthetic or schmanalytic, and you come up with a definition of a schmanalytic proposition, Hume says schmanalytic propositions, however you define them, don't exist. If they're not the same as analytic or synthetic, they don't exist. No proposition is any other kind. No proposition is both. No proposition is both kinds. So there's no proposition that doesn't fit into one of these categories, and there's no proposition that fits into both of these categories. Every proposition is either analytic or synthetic. If someone comes up with a proposition that isn't analytic or synthetic, Hume would say it's nonsense. If someone comes up with a proposition that they claim is both analytic and synthetic, Hume would say, and I would agree, that they're wrong. It's one or the other. Can't be both, but it has to be one or the other. Is this making sense? Analytic propositions are supported by analytic reasoning, which is reasoning from definitions, stipulations, and concepts. Synthetic propositions are supported by one kind of reasoning, which is reasoning from experience. Does that make sense? Reasoning from experience. Sense data. Reasoning from sense data. Experience is another word for all of your sense data coming in all at once. So that's the doctrine. So there's some consequences of this, right? And these consequences actually are sort of the final nail in the coffin of rationalism. These consequences of this distinction. If the distinction is justified, rationalism is dead. Claims about existence can only be supported by sense data. Analytic reasoning cannot support such claims. And of course, the corollary is that claims about definitions and stuff are immune to evidence, so that you can't support a claim about the relationship between two concepts based on evidence. You can support a claim about the relationship between two things by evidence, but not about concepts. So there's two kinds of reasoning: conceptual reasoning and evidence reasoning. Is this making sense? Oh, I forgot to mention some examples. I'm going to give you. I should have mentioned this before. Analytic reasoning includes math, right? Plane geometry, analytic geometry, any kind of math. So I'll put math. be like British. We talk about mathematics, maths are short of mathematics, which is different. You know, any kind of math you can think of, it's analytic reasoning. If you're doing math, you're doing analytic reasoning. And deductive logic, which actually encompasses math, is also a form of deductive reasoning. If you ever do deductive logic, that's it. Right. So what kind of human endeavors are included in synthetic reasoning? Right? If you go to a math class, if you go to a symbolic logic class, you're doing analytic reasoning. What kind of class will you go to see the results of synthetic reasoning? Say again? Metaphysics? There's a metaphysics class here outside of philosophy? But physics, yeah. Physics. And physics is a prime example of synthetic reasoning because physics is trying to figure out the laws by which the real world operates. Right? So it's about the real world. We could make up different laws, but they wouldn't fit the real world. That's what makes physics synthetic reasoning, because we're trying to describe the real world, not some imaginary world. There's also history. I'll throw in chemistry. Any science, anything where you want to talk about the way the world was or the way the world is. Sociology, paleontology, anthropology. Right. Those are all sciences that attempt to describe the actual world. So they fall under the heading of synthetic reasoning. If you're trying to describe the world, you have to be talking synthetic reasoning. Okay. So think about it this way. Does anything that happens in a math class tell you anything positive about the universe? Tell you about anything that exists? Or a deductive logic class? Right. The facts of deductive logic do not support facts of existence. You can't prove anything exists in those classes. Right. So what does this mean philosophically? Well, the first thing it means is that Descartes' argument for dualism cannot work because it is attempts to draw an existence claim from purely conceptual reasoning. So I'm going to put that up here. Oh, I'm going to put these in better sense. Right. So if you remember Descartes' argument for Cartesian dualism, I have a clear and distinct idea of my mind and of my body. I have a clear idea of my mind, I have a clear idea of body, and they're just completely distinct from each other. The idea of body is completely distinct from the idea of mind. Therefore, they actually and in existence, in reality, have nothing in common. So he makes a claim about the existence of mind and body, about their nature in the real world, and supports it with reasoning about how he conceives these things, his ideas of these things. That doesn't work. And Hume's distinction, if Hume's distinction is correct, it proves that it doesn't work. Does that make sense? Sure. Descartes' argument for dualism is an argument based on him thinking about his ideas about mind and body. Think about what Descartes did not talk about when he talked about mind and body. He never said, oh, I looked at this guy and he has certain kinds of ideas and he doesn't have a brain. Descartes never paid. What kind of evidence did Descartes pay attention to in his argument for dualism? None. He did not pay any attention to evidence at all. But he made a claim that something exists that is completely distinct from something else that exists. He claims that mind exists as an immaterial thing that has nothing to do with body, no properties in common with body, no location, no length, breadth, height, mass, none of that. And this is based on, this is how I think of mind. When I think of mind, I think of thought. Its essence is thought, and I think of volition and will and hope and dread and all these things. But he never said, I investigated some specific human being to see what their mind was like. He never said, I examined people whose brains had been damaged and they all had the same mental capacity. What happens when we investigate people whose brains have been damaged? Are their cognitive capacities always unaffected? No, this is empiricism. Empiricism gives us a very different picture. When empiricism investigates the mind, it doesn't sit back and think about concepts. It goes out and looks at actual minds and actual bodies. And it sees people, if you see people whose brains have been damaged in various ways, their ability to think has been taken away, and their ability to control their body has been taken away. What happens to stroke victims who have massive brain damage on one side of their brains? Say it? They lose the side of their body. They get paralyzed. The mind can no longer make the body work. If Cartesian dualism was correct, that would not be possible. That would not happen. Everything we know about mind and body says the brain makes the mind. Because if you take away bits of the brain, bits of the mind go too. Damage to the striate cortex causes loss of visual field. There's no kind of noticeable brain damage that doesn't have a significant effect on the mind. René Descartes never even thought of investigating the actual real-world properties of mind and body. His argument was completely conceptual, and according to Hume, that kind of argument absolutely cannot work because it attempts to draw a synthetic claim to support a synthetic conclusion based on analytic reasoning. All right, is this coming across? Do you guys understand the two kinds of reasoning, the conceptual reasoning and the evidence-based reasoning? Okay, I think I want to take a break, and we'll come back here 5 to 8.